Well, today's reading, Chris, takes us into a number of passages that are intensely erotic, intensely sexual. I think of section 28. Is this then a touch quivering me to a new identity? Flames and ether making a rush for my veins, treacherous tip of me reaching and crowding to help them. My flesh and blood playing out lightning to strike what is hardly different from myself. On all sides, prurient provokers stiffening my limbs. And it goes on and on. It is an amazing passage. I think language has rarely taken us on this kind of an intimate journey through what feels like a very familiar and yet line by line miraculous experience of sexual touch. And one of the amazing things about the passage is that you never can quite determine exactly what's happening. You can't quite determine who the partners are. Are they males? Are they females? Is it a male and a female? It's a celebration of the intimacy and the ecstasy of sexual touch, regardless of gender.
And we may not know who those who these lovers are, but we know it's thrilling, and that new identity is the subject of this session. So, Ed, sex. The procreant urge of the world. Whitman's Sexuality is always a subject of interest to readers, and desire seems to inform so much of the energy of the poem. What do you think?
Yeah, it really is interesting to think in the last 50 years how much sexuality has come to be thought of as the very center of what Whitman is doing. We've really moved from the good gray poet of democracy to the good gay poet of sexuality, and certainly from Stonewall forward through the 70s and 80s and 90s in this country, Whitman began to be conceived as gay. It's interesting. I always think the real question is not was Whitman gay, but when did Whitman become gay from country to country? You know, in Germany, he's been gay since the 1900s, the very early 1900s. And in European readings of Whitman, his homosexuality was assumed pretty much up through the 20th century. America was late coming to it. The notion that homoeroticism defined something at the very heart of Whitman. It's interesting when we go back to American responses to Leaves of Grass in the 19th century, in Whitman's own time. The outrage was always over his portrayals of heterosexuality. Mm-hmm. The Calamus poems, where we see his very erotic and moving portrayals of male sexuality, those seem to have been read in the context of a much more intense kind of friendship in the 19th century, friendship that could often be expressed between members of the same sex in more physical ways than where we've been comfortable in this culture in the 20th century and even the 21st too.
And in the context of the war as well, with soldiers.
Very, very much in the context of the war. But even before the war, Whitman began to conceive of this notion that a democracy, a true democracy, would only exist if there was something more than formal friendship between especially males in the culture. In the capitalistic culture that was forming in Whitman's own time, he felt that this notion of competition, the idea that males were always from very early on taught to compete with each other in all kinds of ways, that democracy was only going to work if males began to feel affection toward each other. And as the Civil War began to take place, Whitman really began thinking about how affection might be the thing that could solve this division among people. When we have a war where fathers and sons are killing each other, brothers are killing each other, the notion that males have to have a physical respect for each other, a respect for each other's body, a love for each other's body, was in his mind the only way that we could have a democracy of true comradeship.
And so he becomes the teacher of athletes.
He becomes the teacher of athletes.
The different understanding of how competition will work between the men. Right?
That's right. Yeah, and you know, he said early on in his notes on, I think of them now as notes on language, but they really are the notes he was using at the time he was writing Leaves of Grass. He said, as he thought about the American language, what he was most struck by was the paucity of words for friendship. We had the word friend, we had the word lover, but we didn't have gradations.
Anything in between.
Yeah, all those gradations that, and so he really invents the word comrade that then gets picked up by early readers and eventually becomes a sort of basis of communist understanding that comes straight from Whitman. That notion of the comrade, literally in its roots, the sharer of a room, the roommate, is a kind of notion for Whitman of how American democracy has to proceed. We have to have a republic of lovers, and so it's interesting to me that the early responses to Whitman focused so intently on his explicit descriptions of male-female love, but those descriptions of male-male love, they almost were out of the realm of what even critical language could deal with. Although there was one very early review of the 1855 Leaves of Grass that ended by mentioning in Latin the word that cannot be spoken, referring to the perversity of sodomy and homosexuality that this critic perceived was somehow at the heart of Song of Myself.
So it becomes yet another one of those things about Whitman that are almost unimaginable for a 19th century reader. Just as the poem seems to come into being out of nowhere, he then presents us with ideas that may take another 100 to 150 years to internalize as a body politic.
Yeah. It's interesting to think of recent developments in our own culture, gay marriage, for instance, and try to imagine what Whitman would have had to say or to think about gay marriage. You know, when I think of Whitman's critique of marriage itself, because marriage he saw as a very hierarchical institution, an institution that, in his day at least, always put the male in the dominant position and the female in the submissive, subservient position. And so he saw a problem with that institution of marriage, and I think he would have been fascinated with the notion that marriage itself might not have been the problem, but there might have been a way in which the culture could progress and evolve in such a way that marriage itself could be redefined in more democratic terms, in terms that ultimately, I mean, one thing that gay marriage seems to be bringing into the conversation is a notion of a non-hierarchical kind of marriage, a marriage with two fathers, a marriage with two mothers, as opposed to a marriage with a dominant father and a submissive mother.
Don't you have the sense that just as he must have been surprised by the speed with which his poem began to come together from 1854 on, he would have been delighted by the speed with which societal attitudes towards same-sex marriage changed in this country and increasingly around the world?
Yes, and you know, this was how he set the whole poem up, right? The Olive Leaves of Grass. It was he began to conceive of it as being written not to the people around him, but to the people that were going to be living 150, 200 years hence, and start the conversation. All right. So how are we doing? How far have we come?
Yeah.
What's it like now with you? He, in 1860, adds a poem called "So Long" to "Leaves of Grass" and makes it the final poem. And in that poem, he projects a much more perfected democracy, but he sees that it's going to only come in time. It's going to take time. It's going to take so long.
Yeah.
So as he's saying so long to his reader, goodbye in that sense, he's also saying, I understand it's going to be so long until all the things I'm talking about begin to unfold, begin to evolve. And so part of the fascination that poets today and all through the 20th century had in talking back to Walt Whitman and writing poems back to Whitman was precisely to carry on this ongoing conversation, to carry on this conversation of saying, okay, Walt, let me tell you where we are. Things aren't as good as you hoped they were going to be at this point. And others saying,
we're still catching up.
Yeah, we're still catching up. But there probably are a number of poems in recent years that are being written about, well, Walt, one thing you were talking about, you probably couldn't quite have imagined how it was going to work out, but it is kind of working out the way you thought it might.
He laid the groundwork. Here we are.
Yeah.